Hello out there. I don't know who's watching yet. I'm gonna wait for people to start popping on here. And write questions down here. And I will try to see them, but it is a little challenging. We're a few minutes early here. Going for a Jesus halo effect here. I'm going to be watching myself here on my cell phone as well. I'm actually watching myself. Isn't that crazy? When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore. Somebody has just popped on. Hello, somebody who has arrived. Rosa, how are you doing today? Lovely to see you, or not. We're giving it a few moments to see if other people start to arrive. So please be patient. Hopefully those lights are not causing some sort of Pokemon effect. Are there other people here? If you can hear me, why don't you go ahead and write a comment below. Because I see on my phone there's more people than what it's showing on my counter here. Debbie has joined us. Welcome, Debbie. I think you're in Newbury Park today. We could play a game, where in the world is Debbie and her family today? We're going to start about 3 minutes from now. I'm just waiting to see who else logs on here. I'm watching on my cell phone as well, just to see how confusing it could possibly be. Oh, this shows 11 comments already. Hello. Oh, RB is heading to the beach. I think it's easier to read the comments from my cell phone than it is to try to read them on here. It's not being very helpful. Okay, so, well, I am here to tell you about my work today. Some of you know the story behind the decision to start making work again, but some of you may not, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about that too. I think it was about 7 years ago, when I was living in Houston, Texas, as a dean of the Art Institute there, and I had a really significant car accident. And so after that car accident, I had several surgeries and went through a lot of pain and struggle and sort of reevaluated things and thought about, if I had died in that car accident that day, what is it that I want people to remember me for? And while I think it's a very honorable profession to be the dean of a college, I don't think it was what I really wanted to be remembered for. And I thought back about my life and the things that I wanted for myself, and art was the major thread of that. And the desire to live outside the United States. So I sold everything, and I had been going to Mexico City for many, many years to take photographs, and never quite figured out exactly how I was going to use those photographs. So it seemed like a good opportunity to take this transitional time and move to Mexico City while I was waiting for a job in China. So I ended up spending 3 months in Mexico City exploring with my camera and finding color and texture throughout the city. It's one of my favorite things about Mexico City over the years was exploring that with my camera, because in the United States we tend to clean all the surfaces and build new things, tear down old things, whereas in Mexico City you have, you know, ancient temples next to modern office buildings, and you get to see the wear and tear of daily life and the way that people interact with things. So I started taking those photographs, and then through sort of different events and things, I ended up back in Mexico City when China didn't work out, and it was back in Mexico City that I started to figure out what I was going to do with those photos. So I'm going to walk you through the gallery first and show you a little bit of what's going on in the studio. Okay, I'm getting messages from all over the place. Okay, so this is kind of where it all starts at, is the photographs. So I spend a lot of time when I'm traveling and wherever I live exploring how color and texture and the age of human interaction with things take place. So these photos that you're looking at are from Paris, where I was in February, and most of these photos are sort of macro examples of advertisements that have been interacted with by people and over time have degraded and fallen apart, and then as they fall apart, the way that other people start to interact with them as well. So these are the bases. I call these digital sketches because they become the art pieces. So for instance, get this into frame here. This particular piece right here, let's take a look at that, is also the foundation for this piece of artwork, which I just finished in the last week. So here you can see the elements from the original photograph and then how I built upon them. So that's just to give you a point of reference from the photograph to the actual piece of artwork. This is very awkward to carry an iPad around. Nobody tells you how awkward these things are going to be. So let me give you a quick view around the studio. So there is the sketch wall. And here you can see, I'm going to step all the way back here. So here you can see some of the different pieces. All the work that I'm showing in here is from the last year. So the only one that isn't is the male Frida Kahlo over here, which was done a few months earlier in the year than the rest of these. So this is recognizable by some of the people online, and was exhibited at RISD a year ago spring. So, and then last summer I started to play with scale, having access to a little bit more technology, and so I spent last summer painting these portraits of dogs sleeping. So these two dogs are dogs that were sleeping in Bangkok, and exhibiting their interior dream world, exteriorizing their dream world onto the surface. So those are those. It's very awkward. I almost want to turn the video just to see if you're all paying attention out there. All right. So, trying to get a grip on this camera. All right. So, a lot of my artwork, here's a second piece from the Frida Kahlo, which is still yet to be completed. And I know it probably looks fairly complete, but the problem that I have with it is the background. And I have recently been experimenting with acetones to remove paint and then build the surface back up. And of course, my usual scratching away and peeling away of the paint, and you can see in the crown here that I've done a lot of etching. So my background really is in printmaking and drawing, and when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time by myself with fashion magazines and other magazines that were available at my grandparents' and other places, and I would basically go through and map out with markers all the different areas of color inside of the person's face. And the reason for that was because I was sort of operating from what it was that I knew, which was paint by numbers, because my parents would give me paint by numbers every year for Christmas and, you know, randomly, and I would use these paint by numbers. And I thought the best way to learn how to understand how the faces are constructed artistically was to go through the face and look for different colors and then draw circles around each of those colors and then go back in and fill those colors in. And then in college, I spent a huge amount of time taking photographs and then etching the prints and then reburning the prints. And this is before digital technology, of course. So in a dark room, and then using those etchings and making etchings out of that. So all the different things, the different ways that I've approached the work have played out in the current work and what it is that I'm doing. I'm going on to the comments here just to check in. All right, everybody's showing up. And so those different things in a linear fashion led up to a time when I had moved back to Mexico City after China, and sort of a failed experiment in Connecticut as well, doing something purely just for income and not for the love of it, and then moving back to Mexico City. Now, the way I started was because I had no space and I didn't really know what it was that I was going to be doing with them, was taking the photos, and I would go get them printed at a local like a photo booth place, just, you know, insert a USB drive and have them printed out 5x7, and then I would take those with me with all my little acrylics and things, and markers and stuff, and I would take them to coffee shops, and I would just sit in coffee shops and work on them all day. And it was a great way to experiment and sort of figure things out. And then once I started to go a little bit larger, discovering new things, and then about a year into that, feeling a little dissatisfied, I went quite large, maybe like a 36 by 36, which was a dramatic change, and started to play with oil pastels. Most of the work that I created during that time when I started adding the oil pastels did not work. Well, they worked. They looked quite beautiful at the time, and then a few months later they would fall apart. And the reason for that would be because you're mixing water and oil together. So, and I'm going to be showing you a little bit of that in a moment. So I had to begin experimenting and lose my fear of failure and try new processes to see if they were going to work or not. And at a certain point, I left my teaching job and stayed at a friend's place and spent a good 4 or 5 months just doing an intensive experiment with the materials and trying to get the technique down. And then I moved back to the United States. So it was very, I think the important thing about this is that losing the fear of failing and something looking bad was really important. And I think that kept me from doing art for years because I was uncomfortable with that area in between novice and professional. And I had to allow myself to make mistakes and fail and be willing to share that with other people to see what it was that they saw in the work. So I think that's really, really important to understand about that. So I think what I would like to do is show you the materials that I work with and then see what kinds of questions also come up, and then I can actually show a little bit of what I'm doing as well. Okay, so and take you over to the supply table here. Let's see if I can do this without making you all dizzy. Okay. All right, so I'm not sure why the camera feels like it's zooming in, but all right, so these are the supplies that I'm working with. You'll note that I have lots of different colors of markers and pencils. Here are my oil paints. These stubs are extremely important because I don't use paintbrushes to do my work. So I consider myself more of a draftsman than a painter. I love painterly qualities, like if you look at a Cy Twombly painting and you see these big brush strokes that are exaggerated, and he sort of eliminates everything else behind that and plays with that painterly moment. I love those painterly moments. However, my work is a lot more detailed and less minimalistic than his work is. So, and then here are the oil pastels, and I divide them by the way that I use them. So, so I have warm and cold, and there is a difference here, not just in scale. So these are Holbein, and these are Sennelier oil pastels. They're not oil sticks, they're oil pastels, so they have a medium inside of them. And then the Holbein. And the difference, major difference here is the firmness. So the Holbeins are very, very firm. And so I get a different quality from that than I do from the very soft ones. which allows me to play with line and experiment more with how the different mediums work together. So, other things that are very important to this. Turpentine, good old turpentine. Some acetone. Acetone is really great for removing something, but also for when it removes it, it plays with the paper texture. And so I can get different textures with the acetone. This is a quick dry medium, and I have two different ones that I use. They're different. You can see this one is much more thick, and this one is thinner. So sometimes when I'm going for a watercolor effect, I might put down some oil pastel and then use this to create a watercolor effect. So if you go back and you look at the Sleeping Dogs series that I did last summer, the white dog has a lot of the watercolor effect in the actual dog itself. And typically when I do pet portraits and there's really fine hair, I'll utilize this and this. So this one is a little bit thicker, and interestingly enough, when used with this Winsor satin varnish, the varnish interacts with these mediums and creates another texture that I can respond to when I put another layer on top. So as I work, generally, putting down marks on the surface and moving it around, I do not use any paintbrushes in the process. So I could put this down onto the surface, and then what I would do is I would come back in with a varnish after mapping out an area, and I would spray that with the varnish, usually a lot more than I'm just demonstrating. So once this dries, then I'm able to go back through with markers and pencils and push that around, and I might be removing it in the process, or I may be laying down an actual line, and then as I go through that process of pushing and pulling that, and then coming back in with a rag with turpentine on it, or acetone, or coming in with a medium, and using these stubs, these simple little stubs, I can spend hours and hours pulling and pushing the pigment onto the paper. And I would show you this texture that's coming out of it, but I don't think that the camera's going to actually capture that. It's something that is a lot easier to see in person, definitely. So this process of going back and forth heavily relies on two things for it all to stay together. Number one is this, the varnish, and number two is the acrylic matte varnish. And this is what transformed the work in terms of being able to hold the surface over larger pieces. Working small, it's a lot easier in terms of keeping the surface stable than working large. When you get large, things start to compete a little bit more. So when I decided to start experimenting with the acrylic varnish, this made a huge difference. So after the varnish here that I sprayed on dries, when I go back over it, this particular texture is different than this texture or the textures of the mediums that I'm using. So it's that language that occurs between the materials is how the effect comes out of the work. So in a sense, I've created an artistic language in the process in which I understand that when I go on to a printed color that's a red with a specific other color, I get an interaction between those colors, but I also can create the texture that you see in the works that makes it, I think, more distinctive, and that sort of luster between the layers all comes from going between varnishes. So that when I go through with an oil pastel and then with a pencil or a marker, these water and oil things interact with each other differently. But also, I want to point out, and I've had a lot of people ask me, if you're only using your hands when you do this process and the stubs, how do you get a lot of the detail? a lot of the detail comes from pencils and markers. So once the surface is active and the color starts to get in there, then I can go into these different areas, and this marking could have the impression of pulling the oil pastel away. So I just marked on that, and then I'm going to, well, you probably can't see that, it's a little tiny dot, and you can see that a little bit of the oil pastel comes up. So I have now revealed some of the original color that was below it, along with this color, and giving it a line texture detail by removing it. And then I can go back through, adding more varnish and other colors, and all these different layers will compete with each other to create an effect. And that's the funnest thing about creating the artwork, is the effect that it has is almost magical in some ways. But it's a learned language that I have in my mind, and I'm like, okay, so how do we solve this problem in the image? A lot of times in these images, I am looking for texture and other colors that I can pull out. So I'm going to bring you over to Joan of Arc as a perfect example of this. Let's see if I can set it down here. Okay, so in here you see there's a lot of color and texture. So all my work is sourced from photographs, and for the most part, about 98% of these are just camera raw photos. So this particular section was likely much smaller, definitely in its origin. I look for these sort of macro moments in the streets and things, and try to find these things. And then I wanted to create emphasis on this ideal of her kind of clutching onto this jewelry and give it sort of a rosary effect. And I saw inside of this particular photograph, because I'm shooting most of this work with my cell phone camera, which happens to be like a 16 megapixel Galaxy, and it's a higher resolution, but not as good a depth as my professional camera. But it actually creates an interesting effect in the pixels when you take an image and then you blow them up. So you get this very pixelated effect, and what happens in the process of doing this is almost reconstructing the image together. So I'm creating my own reality by taking detail out by using black, and then creating emphasis in the piece of artwork so that your eyes are drawn in different ways. And this particular piece right here, I did two digital things that I'm kind of a purist from old school days, and I try not to use Photoshop much because I feel like it affects the integrity of the work, and I'm challenging myself on that right now a little bit. I'll show you in a moment. But this particular strip is from another image, and I just stripped that in to the image, and then this mask effect was not part of the original photo, but I wanted to create emphasis and connection between the eyes and her grasping her sort of rosary effect here. So in here, in the pixelization, there are opportunities to get dust off the top of your work. There are opportunities to create very sort of impressionistic effects with those distorted pixels. And also a deep fascination with how things get ripped away, and the edges of paper, and this ideal that these are all maps. So I'll show you in this particular piece right here. And so in this particular piece here, which is a dual panel series that was exhibited at the South Bay Contemporary, on the bottom of the piece, I often will sit back from a piece and I'll be like, if you're a graphic designer and you were dealing with this image as an illustration for a cover, what would you do in order to create emphasis, balance things out, and draw the eyes into specific things? So in this particular piece, you'll see that there is almost like a topographical overview map of, if you were looking at like just like a Google Earth map where you could see the terrain. So at this particular time, I was riding down from Ojai to Ventura and back in my old studio, and I would ride through Lake Casitas, and so I would see these dramatic sunsets. So like this area right here is the narrative of riding through those through the valley up through Lake Casitas and seeing this sunset reflected on the lake. Whereas like over here, I'm really emphasizing a lot of the color and texture, and I had quite a bit of anxiety about this particular area because I didn't think that the red brick that was being exposed below was a very interesting texture. So I had to work through that fear of what I was going to do. And over here, I do this a lot in my white areas. So here is that sort of watercolor effect that I was talking about, where I use the really thin medium that dries really quickly, but it allows me to push the oil pigment around the page, and it actually works really well with the markers as well. I'm going to pull back from this because these two pieces right here, if I can get them oriented, these two pieces right here are really important. So I did these just after the election, and these two pieces took up all of November, and sort of ended up in a raging flu at the end of it, because I was possessed and I needed to work out my anxiety about the election and the things that were happening politically. And so this is all about the way that words were being used during the campaign, the way culturally we use words in order to tear other people down and apart. And dismantle them. And I wanted to use that language that tears people apart to create something beautiful, but also that has a deeper meaning and makes you look at it and think about, you know, why is this beautiful face of this woman being masked, and what's happening behind her eyes. And then of course, in this particular piece on the other side with the red eyes, this sort of explicit like spraying of the eyes with red spray paint to emphasize this sort of blinding effect. And these are meant to represent the language used in hate against women and immigrants and the LGBT community. So these two pieces were displayed as a billboard. They had a base and a frame built around them, and double-sided with lighting, and I removed that and threw the base out because it took up an extreme amount of space and there was really no room for it. And I felt like at the end of the day that I will probably end up reframing this completely. Oops, sorry about that, guys. That must be very disjointing. I'm going to go look at my timeline here really quickly and see if anybody's posted any questions. Thank you, Peter. On the other side, I was talking about this idea of not using Photoshop. I teach Photoshop. I teach graphic design. And I watch my students use this software all the time, and I love watching them. On my screen, I can see all their screens. And I like watching the way that they construct their images and the thought process that reveals behind it. And you can really learn a lot about the way somebody thinks when you are experiencing the construction of their images. So I've allowed myself to do some of that. In this particular piece that's hanging up on the wall right now, which is in process. Let's see if I can get that into frame. This is about, I want to say 50 by 32. I utilized several photographs from paintings that I'd already accomplished, and I put them together with an image that I took of another person as well, and combined them inside of Photoshop to create this image. So this particular one will be the first sort of full departure from my rule about Photoshop as an experimentation. You have to check back and see if it actually works out well or not. One of the things I like about it is that I'm using the colors and textures that I created instead of these found color and textures and combining them together. So I'm not, it's like a regeneration. So I'm using something from the Saint Sebastian, something from the Vagrant Desires, the previous piece, the texture of pillows and blankets laying on my bed creates sort of a landscape feeling. And then I utilize the circle from this particular piece. So you can see that circle. And then this is the Vagrant Desires piece. I'll talk a little bit about that. This piece came out of kind of frustration, as artwork often does. I had recently put myself back out there on the market on these dating apps online, and found it very frustrating the way that people utilized their words and images to represent themselves, kind of a language that is birthed out of those particular mediums, but the language and the images don't really represent their true desires. So in this particular image, which is purposely oriented like a cell phone, I wanted to expose that language and show the layers and the beauty and the depth there. And then if you look to, well, I can't tell what side it is for you. I'm going to say it's your right side. You'll see the face staring out. There's a young man staring out. And then the reason I put him in there was because there's this voyeuristic effect that happens where you're the voyeur, they're the voyeur, you're exhibitionist, they're exhibitionist, and all these roles are playing around and changing, and the way that we sense attraction based on these digital experiences is an odd language to me. So I've been exploring that language, and that particular piece, Vagrant Desires, is played out a little bit more in this piece, which I had not titled because originally that vertical piece was to sit down the middle where you see the part in the two pieces. So once I did that, I didn't like how it broke the circle, and I felt like the graphic was stronger with the circle than it was when it was parted. And you can see on the opposite side here than the last piece, there's another figure standing inside of the in there, a little bit more masked. So playing with perspective as well. And then this is Bacchus, and I chose 3 different sort of queer saints. Bacchus was in a secret relationship as part of a commander in the Roman army, and if you look towards the bottom, there's a sort of a stripe coming across the bottom there, and that is actually his lover reaching around him. And these two were basically excommunicated from the military because they were open about their relationship, and then sort of put into obscurity and then brought back out again, I think, in the 14th century. And there are actually some chapels, I think one's in Istanbul and one's in France, sort of like this cult following of Bacchus. But what I find interesting about saints and Catholicism is that we remove their sexuality from them. So at this time of political challenges, to say the least, I felt a need to bring the queer perspective back into things, and I wanted to talk about this ideal of how when we look at these people who we sort of deify in our culture, how we remove their sexuality from that element when they're gay or lesbian or trans, and they are not fully expressed. They're sort of these pared down versions of themselves, almost like a graphic Che Guevara on a t-shirt is a pared down version of who Che Guevara really was and the history behind what it was he did, good and bad, for people. So that's where these other saints came from. So we saw Joan of Arc here, and then this is my version of Saint Sebastian as well. And I'm going to come a little bit closer to Saint Sebastian here because I freed myself up in this particular one to really experiment with the shapes and all the blue striping and the elimination of negative space and the use of these colored lines and the way that I put these together. I allowed myself to combine these techniques a little bit more. So you'll see some of the watercolor effect in the stone, and then in the paper areas over here, you'll see that I spent more time detailing. So over time, I have kind of adjusted the technique based on what I'm seeing in the image and how it's being constructed, but also based on the amount of time I want to spend on the image. And I have found that sometimes when I get caught up in the detail work, I could get lost for months in a particular piece, and that's not necessarily the way that I want to work. Just as an example, here in the studio, I actually keep this photo next to this one, so you could see this is the original digital image I took. This was on a building on Insurgentes in La Roma in Mexico City. It's this dilapidated building that's sort of like a gridiron, modern style building, glass and steel, that's falling apart. And there are vendors below it, and surrounding the first floor, it becomes sort of like the place to post advertencias. So that building has shown up a lot in my work because it changes consistently over time. But when you look at this as the original, and then how that plays out, I think it gives a better idea of what the expression is and how I'm using the technique. All right, I'm heading back over here because we're 40 minutes in, and I want to see if anybody is asking any questions. Fragrant or vagrant? It's vagrant desires. You'll have to look up the word vagrant. Susie, my parents are not creative. My mother is a programmer and accountant. My stepfather is a former realtor. I'm adopted. I don't know if my birth parents are creative. Obviously, it's somewhere in my past. Oh, connection getting dodgy. Okay, I keep losing the question, so I'm sorry. All right, so I'm looking at my cell phone, not looking down at the floor, because it's very difficult to see the questions over here. Okay, so other things that I wanted to bring up in this, especially if you're a young artist watching this, or if you're just you're young if you're just starting out. I just have to get very, very comfortable with failure. So often, especially in today's culture, it seems like we're always giving blue ribbons for everything that's just showing up. Well, I have found in the artistic process that showing up is the most important thing, and then being willing to take chances and destroy things is very important. And I've destroyed a lot of artwork that I really loved because I was experimenting. So even in the Frida Kahlo piece that I showed, where I haven't resolved the background, I knew when I took that acetone to the surface of those paints that I was going to be destroying it in order to see what happened. So I see a few more questions posted here. Peter, what I'm about to start is this piece that I have up here on the wall. This is a combination of 4 different paintings into one, overlaid over the top of an image of a model laying on my bed with the blankets, creating sort of a landscape for him to lay in. And it's a very, it's a very subliminal piece. So there's some eroticism to the piece. Again, I'm still kind of working on this like Grindr, gay dating apps thing about the language and the way desire is expressed. This will be the fourth piece in the series, the larger of all the different pieces. Susie asks, which contemporary artists do I admire? And well, that's always evolving. Lucian Freud has always been at the base of it. And of course, it's if you see me in public, I could know your name, and I'll go to try to introduce you, and I'll forget your name just under the pressure of being asked a name. So Ivan Albright was the reason that I decided to study at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's a Chicago artist. They had a great collection of his, and I really identified with the detail in his work and the emotional qualities of his work. And I would say Gerhard Richter is a huge influence on me. I love the way he uses color. I like his experimentation. I had never really been a fan of David Hockney until I read his biography and got to see his work in person in a larger breadth. And I think that was at LACMA like 4, 5, 6 years ago. I can't remember. They did a great exhibition. There's currently an exhibition of David Hockney at the Getty, and it's very, very small and a little disappointing. But there's this fantastic book outside in the gift store outside of that's just this monumental scale, maybe like 36 by 48. And I spent some time there with some friends paging through that book for a good hour, and it was fantastic. So if you have $2,500 to spend on a book, that's the book. And I'm totally good with accepting that as a gift. You can send it to my studio at H Gallery. Other questions that people have? Not seeing anything. So yes, so this is the new studio space. On next Saturday evening, August the 19th, there will be a gallery opening downstairs, and all the studios will be open as well, so you'll have the opportunity to come in. And then on September the 17th, we're doing a open studio event here. All the artists have collaborated on an art piece that we will sell raffle tickets, so you could win an art piece for $10 that represents all the artists here at H Gallery. And there'll be a new the exhibition will be open up downstairs as well, so and you'll be able to tour through all the different studios as everybody is committed to being here for that particular event. That's the work. That's a very brief overview of everything that I'm working on. The process is fairly flexible and influenced by whatever's happening, and definitely influenced by travel. So every time I go somewhere, it changes my perspective on what I'm doing in my artwork and what I want to create. But over the last year, I have definitely become more politically oriented, as I have felt that the political climate requires me to be visible in a very different way. And I adopted the sort of title queer artist after not really referring to myself maybe since ACT UP days as queer, because I felt like it was important to show differences and diversity, and to challenge people to look at things from a different perspective as well. So whether you're coming at it from a straight perspective, a heterosexual straight, or you're coming at it from your own experiences, I'm challenging people to look at things viewed through this queer eye. And to me, that ideal of the queer eye in art is always about taking something that is mundane and normal and something that you would pass by and elevating it to an aesthetic, artistic quality. Giving it just that little something that pulls it together. I'm going to go back over. It says 41 comments. Talk about Mexico and your muse. Oh my gosh.
You know, I grew up in what I would say it was a lower middle class, poor family, and when we traveled, we lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. We traveled to Gatlinburg, Tennessee was a big deal. You know, so my circle as a kid was always quite small, and I was always looking outside of that circle, wanting to leave. I never really felt like I was a part of what was happening there. I didn't feel a part of anything there. So when I turned, you know, at a certain age, I think I just got on a train and I went to work in Sequoia National Park. The point being is that once I started to expand the circle, and then I started to move all over the United States, I realized that I really wanted to experience other cultures. And I was living in Los Angeles, and I think I'd seen a documentary about Mexico City and the history, and I'm just so fascinated by history that I decided to go to Mexico City for the first time, and that was a hugely eye-opening experience for me. Like, that is where I had started taking the photos. I think the first photo I took was at Xochimilco, in the canals of Xochimilco. Xochimilco is this ancient Aztec canal system, and the whole city used to be built on a lake, and since then the lake has dried up. But this particular chunk of those canals still exists today, and it's open. It's where they grow the flower markets, and then you can rent I don't know what you call the boats, I can't remember, a boat that's decorated, and these decorated archways on the boats would reflect onto the water, and those reflections of the colors moving in the water and the photographs that I took there were the inspiration for everything. I was just fascinated by this ideal of this altered reality in the water. And those photographs I took are still a part of what I do today. And just the experience of Mexico in terms of there's a vast disparity, just like in the United States, between poor and rich, but it's so much more extreme, and there's more people on the poor side of it than there are on the rich side of it. So you end up with these different ideas about what aesthetic living is, or the importance of being in aesthetic living, but also these streets, they get layered with all these advertisements and trash and various different things, and the pollution from the air. And then, I'm walking home and I see a movie that I paid 60 pesos for, and I made 100 pesos that day, and maybe I got frustrated and tore the advertisement. And then what happens to those edges as the pollution and the water and sun and everything beats onto it, and it just creates this really unique surface. That's Mexico is a huge muse for me. And turn it into a piece of art. Rosa asks, can we send you our favorite photos to be manipulated and turned into pieces of art? You can. I don't do that as much anymore. I try to work mainly with photos that I've taken. I've done different projects before, like in Mexico City. The 6 months prior to it, when I left, I did a thing called collab art with a K, and I would take people's selfies, and I would paint those selfies, and then give them the digital copy back, and then they could use that in their social media profiles. And because I had this idea that I wanted my art to be able to interact with people, and I wanted to see if changing from a photograph to a painting in social media affected the way people perceived the person or the value of that image, because we're so possessed with selfies, and I can't leave out this ideal of like the Instagram filters and things, and how people feel. I've actually had people say to me, well, what you're doing I can do with an Instagram filter, and I don't talk to those people because that's like the most oversimplification of an artistic process that you can possibly imagine, because that's an algorithm applied to an overall general image, whereas I'm going in pixel by pixel and manipulating those pixels by hand. So this is a handmade image, not a digital image. The answer to your question, Rosa, is I will always do anything for you, Rosa. But as a general rule, I don't do that that much anymore. Okay. Well, how are we doing here, guys? What else do you want to know? There's still some time left. Let's see. Who all is on here? I can't see. Well, you know, the Apple interface is terrible, but I didn't think that my battery would last through this entire broadcast on my phone, so I decided to use the iPad instead. I hope that this encourages you if you're not artistic and you would like to be artistic, or you're trying to be artistic and you get frustrated, so that you know that we're all frustrated. But we get through it and find the value in all the other things that we can do with that. I just keep clicking these buttons, hoping that it will show me who's here, so that I can try to get you to answer a question. Oh, solo exhibition. I don't have any solo exhibitions coming up. First, exhibitions are extremely expensive. So, like for instance, the piece that was at RISD, that small piece, even though I recycled a frame that I had from Mexico, and just the shipping to and from, and insurance, and all the other things that went along with that, was $400 or $500 just for that one piece. So when you look at putting on an entire exhibition, it's quite expensive. It is definitely on the list of things that I would like to do, but the work that I have here, I feel like I need probably a good 10 more pieces to mount a solo exhibition that goes in this particular vein, and then there'll be the time when I need to start collecting the money for the framing and all the other things that come along with that. There's the secret hidden thing that they don't tell you about art. It's really, really expensive. So you might have to do what I did and move into a camper so that you can afford a studio space and your art supplies. But it is a goal. I would like to have a solo exhibition, but I'm really, really picky about where my art is being exhibited, how it's being exhibited, and how I want it to be seen. So I've done some experimentation with that, and there's definitely some guidelines that I put into place. Group exhibition, other than the 2 events coming up, one next Saturday and then the September one, nothing yet. I have submitted to several. I submit to 2 different exhibitions every month, which each one of those costs $45 to $75 per submission. So as part of my art budget, I submit to different shows every month. So you don't really hear from them very often. Of course you do if you get in. And I've had to limit the scope of where I can do these to drivable distances, because the shipping costs can be so extreme. And it kind of depends on what the show is and who the curator is and stuff, because I've, of course, had some not so great experiences talking to you, South Bay Contemporary in San Pedro, California. Noted. Shamed publicly for that one. All right. Any other questions? Any Ventura-based or LA artists you would ever like to collaborate with, to do an exhibition with, another artist who has similar visual language to you? Well, there's an artist named Bruce LaBruce that I would love to do a show with. He's not an LA-based artist, but he does have a space here that he exhibits in, and I would love to do a show with him. He's very off the map, probably not the most well-known. He's very queer, risque, aesthetic, and I really like the way that he plays with sexuality and fear and desire. So I think that's really important. I can't think of any. It's that name thing. I'll come back and I'll comment on your question later, because tonight at about 3 in the morning I will be woken up with a list of names that I'm going to want to express to you, and I won't call you. I'll just type it into the comments, and then if anybody else wants to know, they don't have to wait for me to call them at 3 in the morning. 2018, yes. Oh, yes, 2018, definitely. I really wanted to do more in 2017, but the cost of maintaining the studio, increasing the size of the work, because my ultimate goal, this is where it's going, is and that's why the exhibition thing is really interesting too, because my goal would be to get a billboard on the side of the freeway and go and work with that billboard as the surface. So create an actual piece of artwork that is in a public sphere, that does what this is doing, but also is open to the environment and will age with the environment. So so that piece of art will change based on sun and rain and all the other elements interacting with the surface. So that is a big goal of mine, and hopefully I'll be able to find somebody who will allow me to do that on their big billboard in a location where it will actually be seen, not on the side of a farm field with no traffic next to it. Anyway, thank you guys for showing up. I hope that you will take the time to write in more questions if you think about them after the fact, and I'm always willing to share like list of materials for the way that I work, but the process itself, because I've spent so much time on it, is my process. So you could take those materials and experiment with yourself, and then you know, whether it happened immediately or takes 3 or 4 years like it did me to figure out how to combine them, then that will be your experiment, and then we can share notes and learn from each other. So thank you for coming today to my cyber studio experience. I don't know how to turn this off. Finish right there.